So I'm speaking to Sagar Tetali, who, like every other Telugu person, is a software engineer and is also an insane movie buff who writes about movies. So, hi Sagar and welcome. I just want to start off by the most recent Telugu movies that have come out. And if you notice Diwali today, and if you see theaters in Hyderabad, the one movie that is actually performing the best in terms of tickets sold is a dub of a Tamil movie, Amaran, starring Sivakarthikeyan and Sai Pallavi. And after that, we have a Telugu movie, but starring a Malayalam actor, Dulquer Salman, as the main lead, Lucky Bhaskar. And that in general is like a sort of a smaller sample of the broader trend in Telugu that we must be the only industry that is so welcoming of actors from other languages working in our movies, and especially even in the most native of movies. And also, we're the most welcoming of dubs from other languages. I know Tamil has some dubbed movies that have worked well. Malayalam has a huge fan base for Vijay, but we are really special in the sense that we watch everything. We watch anything from a Malayalam to a Hindi to a Tamil to a Kannada movie. So, what makes you think is the reason for that sort of openness to other languages?
Industries kind of have um, some cultural things in common, which is they all come from shared theatrical traditions like theater. There's a Kannada, Telugu, Tamil tradition of theater, and there's a lot of the old mythological films come from that. So for instance, like Maya Bazar and all of these kind of films. And a lot of the early films were adaptations of stage plays, and they would cross over. Like Maya Bazar did really well in Tamil, did really well in Telugu. There's like Tamil films that did really well in Telugu and all of that. And both the industries of Tamil and Telugu were based out of Chennai, Madras at the time. But I also think there is, like what you said, there is a specific quality to Telugu, the Telugu film culture, which absorbs things from everywhere. Patala Bhairavi, obviously, it's an adaptation of a story, but like there is a Hollywood fantasy influence there. There is,
Arabian Nights.
there is Arabian Nights, exactly. It's Arabian Nights Indianized, and then it's that being put on film. But one is obviously the story is borrowing from the Arabian Nights, which is it's I think from a collection of short stories. But the film itself is trying to go for this Hollywood fantasy thing that's going on at the time, and that's not too dissimilar. There are of course some differences, but not too dissimilar from what's happening now with Rajamouli's mythologicals and
Yeah.
things like that. So I think there is a with Malayalam for cinema, for instance, there's a very specific, there is a aesthetic continuity between, what you see in the golden age of Malayalam cinema and what you see now, from the Adur Gopal Krishnans and all of them to what you're seeing now, right now. With Telugu, there are some things which are continuing and not all of them are probably desirable, but there is the sense of you know, open-heartedness towards other kinds of films.
Mm.
Towards, Vikram was really big in Telugu as well.
Yeah. Even
And
Surya.
some of the, yeah, Jawan, yeah, I mean, it was crazy in Hyderabad. I mean, obviously it has to do with Shah Rukh Khan's pan-Indianness and all of that. But it's there is because I've grown up with Tamil films.
Yeah.
I've grown up with Rajnikant films and Kamal Hassan films. Kamal Hassan has done films in Telugu, like Sagar
Yeah.
Sangam and all were huge. But also, the first time I heard Rajnikant's original voice, I was shocked because for me it was always the Manoj dub.
Yeah.
That was a voice that was just in my head with Rajnikant. So I think it's just exposure to other film industries, just like the sense of being permeated by all these streams coming in from everywhere.
Right.
Um, and I think that's what it is. Yeah.
And also, if you think about dub movies and the sort of other language influences, I mean, we
Mm,
always had that, but it was also that Telugu movies also would do well in other languages at times. For example, Shiva was
mm,
huge in Tamil. Nagarjuna was a
mm,
bona fide star at points, and he acted also he was the star of the biggest budgeted Tamil movie at the time and all that.
mm,
But especially from the 90s, I think, especially with Shankar, with A.R. Rahman, and with
mm,
Rajnikant, and because Kamal and Maniratnam and others, they started off with Telugu movies. They got popular making Telugu movies, and
mm,
that brand association continued in the dub films. But I think it
mm.
was really Shankar, ARR, and like Rajinikanth who made an impact with only dubbed films in
Yeah.
Telugu, and that kind of with
Yeah.
Surya and Vikram. So, and in the
That's
90s,
accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the 90s, do you think the reason for that was also that in the 90s we had a very precipitous decline in movie quality, especially the later half of the 90s?
In the Telugu film industry.
Yeah,
I actually don't know if that's true because the 90s, yeah, there were a lot of trash movies in the 90s,
yeah,
but if you compare it, I don't because the 90s was when you had the RGV school directors coming in
yeah.
into
But
Telugu, right?
that's why I
So
said later half of the 90s
you
because
had Krishnavamsi doing his thing.
hmm,
You had yeah, possibly. I mean, the later half of the 90s, uh, yeah, there was a decline. I would argue that right now we're going through a period which is probably far worse than what the late 90s was for
right,
Telugu cinema. I'm not talking in terms of box office. I'm talking
right,
just in terms of movie quality. But you had Gunashekar coming up, you had, Krishnavamsi coming up. It wasn't, I mean, again, when we think of the era, we tend to think of the better movies of the era
yeah,
and not necessarily the volume. So I don't know if I can make an accurate assessment of that era. But I think it also has to do with the fact that the 90s, the film industry completely had transitioned to Hyderabad. Like there was this
right,
gradual transition from Chennai to Telugu film. So the cleaving of the Telugu and Tamil industry was much more sharp.
hmm,
And so there is the in a certain sense the films also became distinct, and then the dub, clearly Shankar is a very Tamil filmmaker. Like the there are very Tamil things about there's a certain aesthetic and there's a certain thing about that which is very separate from, let's say, Krishna Vamsis,
yeah,
right? So I think, yeah, so the dub, I think Shankar's films also have that appeal. I mean, we can talk about the politics and whatnot of the films, but they also have that kind of appeal that crosses over, right? I mean,
yeah,
Nayak is very culturally, it's permeated in Bollywood discourse and Bollywood pop
yeah,
culture the way that Mudalwan has and the Telugu dub Okke Okkadu has. So yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. Rajinikanth also is huge in Telugu. I'm surprised they didn't market his latest film as much in the Telugu states because yeah, Rajnikant is as big a star as anybody else in
yeah,
Telugu, I would say. It's not far off from the biggest stars that we have.
yeah.
So yeah.
And your statement that the late 90s are much better than anything we have these days. This also brings me to a point that Telugu audience really can't agree on what our so-called golden era is, right? With Malayalam, the
Hmm,
unanimous answer is 85 to 95. With
hmm,
Hindi, everyone says the 70s. With Tamil,
hmm.
there are different views, but mostly it would be late 80s, early 90s. The Shankar,
Yeah.
Maniratnam, Kamal, Rajini era, Raja era. But in
Hmm.
Telugu, do we really have a golden age? And if so, what would that be according to you?
It's difficult. I mean, I think an answer a lot of people would give you is the 50s. They would say, we had the Vijay Vahani films.
Yeah,
You had the fantasy films.
yeah,
At that era with AVM and Vijay Vahani and KV Reddy doing his thing, Kamalakar Kameshwara doing his thing. Um, and then we had all the social dramas of that era as well.
yeah,
There was like a lot of Nehruvian socialism in the
yeah.
films. There was a lot of the films, like you take something like Ramudu Bhimudu, we still, I mean, RRR has so much of Ramudu Bhimudu, right?
I mean, Ramanu
So
Bhimudu is like the foundational masala movie.
the
I
foundational masala
Yeah,
film, in a sense, yeah, yeah.
and I remember watching the movie. I
Um,
was so shocked. NTR gets like a very, if you remember, NTR has a very different title card in the movie. So there are a bunch of people
yeah,
clapping their hands, and it shows NT Ramarao, and that is literally
yeah.
that must be the first title card for a movie star in any Indian movie that I've seen.
It's the anticipatorial sort of like the that thing which builds anticipation, and then yeah, the superstar card which we have for Rajnikant now,
Yeah,
which yeah, that's probably, yeah, you're right. You might be right. That might be the first. Um, at least I can't think before that, but
yeah,
yeah, I think it's the fact that with Telugu cinema, it's difficult because the 50s, I think most people would tend towards the 50s. I think there is somewhat an argument to be made for the 80s as well, but the
yeah,
80s big films were not, I would say the large films were still not great. Like those films don't age well.
true.
I think the films that we think of when we think of the 80s, when we think of, say, like Sitara or Sagar Sangamam or any of these films, they were still not in the mainstream as such. but
Hmm.
there's a lot of filmmakers who were making middle cinema. I
Yeah.
don't think we've had art cinema. We've had we've had B. Singh Rao
Yeah.
doing his thing and all of that. But it's hard. I think it's always been a mixture of like really, really, really bad films, and then there've been filmmakers trying to do their thing. I would say the early 2000s was an era that somewhat underrated
True.
in
I
terms of
agree.
the quality of the big mainstream films. But I might also be biased because, that's the era I came of age. Like that's 8 years, 9 years. I was
Yeah.
watching, Okkadu, Indra, all these films. I was coming of age, and maybe somebody who's grown up in the 80s would have the same kind of affinity towards, Adavi Ramudu or something like of that sort.
Right.
So I'm slightly biased. I think the early 2000s was also a good era. And a lot of Telugu films were remade in Tamil, and of course we know about Gilli being remade from Okkadu, all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. But um, yeah, because you had it's that thing. You had the RGV proteges. You had Teja, you
Yeah.
had Gunashekar, you had Krishnavamsi, and they were all sort of peaking together. And yeah, um,
Yeah.
I don't know.
And
I don't really know if there's an answer. I would say, in terms of a year, maybe 2022 is like a very interesting year because there were
yeah.
so many films that were
Yeah.
really
True.
great.
It. We
But
had
that's like
a.
1 year.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's been a desert since then. But yeah.
Yeah. And also, you were talking about RGV's proteges, but I can make an argument that somewhere I think some of RGV's proteges are slightly overrated,
Hmm,
and some of their movies don't really age very well, especially Krishnavamsi.
hmm,
Because
hmm,
I mean, you take Gulabi, the first half is pretty great. It's great, light fun and all that with that famous bike
hmm,
song. But the second half, when she's
hmm,
missing and like there's too much of it's too over the top at times. Like the performances, the
hmm,
overall pitch. Even
hmm,
Antapuram, I was just shocked at how melodramatic it all was. It was just
hmm,
a bit too, and especially given that RJ was like the guy who made subtlety like the mainstay in his movies.
hmm,
And similarly, again, Teja also, like Nijam is extremely over the top at times. So, and these movies don't really age well. And even Nine Pellarta, you take the last
hmm,
half an hour of Nine Pellarta, it just crashes at that point. I don't know what goes on there with Krishnavamsi, especially his endings, but they just
hmm,
completely crash. And you get the feeling that all of RGV's proteges, they had great potential, but they never
hmm,
achieved greatness. Like something held them back.
hmm. I think I take a slightly different opinion on the melodrama part of it because I think for me, some of the most favorite parts of Krishnavamsi films are the endings, whether
Right.
that's Murari or Ninne Pelata. So
Yeah.
I think that I also had an aversion to melodrama for a long time, and it's only in the last couple of years or so that that's changed. And I think that I like really well done melodrama, and that it might also be um, like a personal bias, but I think there is a certain tendency for us to associate subtlety with um,
Good acting and good
artistic
quality.
merit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in some cases, like there are some directors where I'm just like, okay, like yeah, that's really over the top and that's really bad. But I also think, for instance, the last act of Murari, and like, I think that's the best part of it when he's like, I mean, spoilers, but when
Oh
he's
yeah,
stabbed and
I'm
he's trying to,
considering Murari as an exception. I think
yeah,
Murari is actually his most
hmm,
well realized movie. Like Sinduram is
well realized moments.
yeah,
Yeah,
like Sinduram has greater higher points, but it's
yeah,
very like uneven the whole movie
it's
and very
very, very uneven. Yeah.
and it's very didactic. Like
I, Yeah, and to your larger point, I absolutely agree. I think a lot of them had the potential to achieve greatness. I think Gunashekar, you watch something like Okkadu and you're like, wow, this
yeah,
is
yeah,
something. And then you watch films, there's depreciating returns after that, like, Arjun and all of those things where you can see flashes of greatness.
yeah,
Um, I wonder if that's because of how I've always thought this about RGV and the proteges that there is a certain kind of the whole idea of being a maverick is associated with them, but I also
yeah,
think I wonder if that makes them not distance themselves from their collaborators in a sense where
right,
there are people who are giving them sound advice, but they're just like, we got here by our
Film.
vision and the individualistic perspective, and now we don't want to listen to anybody. Krishnamurti, I also think the politics of some of his films kind of, obviously there's some films that really stand out in terms of, and especially compared to films that are coming out now. But yeah, they are dated. I think Khadgam also has a lot of the kind of melodrama that you were talking about,
I
where
mean,
there are people yelling at each other and being
yeah.
very didactic, and yeah, yeah,
I mean, Khadgam especially is, it's like two completely different movies that he just randomly joined. And it's
yeah,
and he probably thinks in his head that the Srikanth and Prakash Raj portions are like the highlight, but no one
mm,
remembers that, and it's only the Ravi Teja
yeah,
portions that really have aged well. Because they're also
yeah,
one of the rare portions that are about the film industry in Telugu that are done well. Unlike Puri
yes,
Jagannath,
exactly.
extremely overrated Ninimpe. And I know you've got not
Yeah.
a big fan of Puri Jagannath, and he is one of the most he is probably the most commercially successful of RGV's proteges. And he's also
Mm,
the one with the biggest cult following after him. So could you just get into why
mm.
you don't get him or why you don't like him?
I think with Puri Jagannath, I think my issue with a lot of Puri Jagannath's films is the fact that um, there is obviously, a lot of people will talk about the way that the women are written, the way that the women
Yeah,
are treated by the central characters, and then there is also a conversation about like, okay, are we supposed to really empathize with the main character? Like, is the main character supposed to be perfect and all of that? But to me, his films seem to be inviting the viewer to to partake in the pleasure of treating women a certain way. Like it's a fantasy in a certain sense. You take something like Businessman, and what it says about women and what it says about the world, it's sort of being didactic in a certain sense, but not didactic exactly, but it's sort of saying, hey, you may believe all these idealistic things about the world, but this is the truth of things. This is how women are, and this is how men are supposed to be. And and I think it constructs this kind of bitter fantasy for like male angst in a sense. And I think that is why I appreciate a lot of Puri Jagannath's filmmaking. I really like how a lot of Pokeri is done, actually. I like
yeah,
how some of the action sequences are built up. I like how I like how the main character is written. There's a lot of Pokeri that I find myself laughing at, like the humor. I find myself like compelled by it, but like I just can't like the film as a whole because there are things that will keep taking me out of it. There's that scene early on where I think Ileana is running like an aerobics class or something,
yeah,
and then um, Mahesh Babu and like the his friends are like going there and like leering at them, and then there's this whole thing about like, oh yeah, like when they're being told to go away, they're like, okay, these people they're doing this exercise because they want us to watch them. And so there's this kind of implication that there's a hypocrisy in women denying consent to men, saying that, hey, that kind of thing. So, and I think that's permeated the film industry because of the success of Pokeri and other films.
right.
And I think that there is a quality to the way that the hero was written prior to 2006, 2007, and I think that changed. And I'm
Mm,
not saying the hero is always like, you look at the early 90s, you look at something like Alluda Majaka and all those Chiranjeevi films, not just Chiranjeevi, but like a lot of the other actors as well. It's not, I mean, the hero is like doubling in a sense as like one, he is fighting for the underdog and all of that, but there's also, he is, treating
showing the
women a
women her
certain
place.
way. Yeah,
Yeah,
the woman has to be put in her place, especially if she's like a rich and arrogant
yeah.
woman, and
Gharana
it's like,
Mogudu.
yeah, Gharana Mugur is another one.
Yeah,
And it's not, yeah, it's all almost all the heroes were doing that. But again, I think from the late, this is why I was a bit hesitant when you said the late 90s was, because the late 90s to early 2000s, I actually think we saw um, the heroes being written a little differently. I think there was also a certain, this could be also because there were a lot of people coming in. There's like a middle class hero that started being written. You had like the Uday Kiran and Tarun films and all of that, and there was a
hmm,
quality to the hero that that was a little like
Yeah.
even you look at the Chiranjeevi films in the late 90s and the early 2000s, it was the same thing. It was like middle
Yeah.
class
Yeah.
family problems, you know.
Yeah.
The Mahesh Babu films were similar.
Hmm.
The Nagarjuna films, I mean, Ninne Paletta is another one,
Yeah.
is another example. Um, and there was a reversion to that kind of hero, I think, after Idiot and Pokeri.
Right.
Um, and then it just got more obnoxious with Desamudru, you know, with Businessman, obviously. Um, yeah, so I think there is it's I think it's very effective in inviting in inviting obviously the assumption is that the viewer is male, and it's
Yeah.
very successful in inviting men to you know, vicariously sort of enjoy this kind of this guy throwing his ego around and like putting other people down and like, you know,
Hmm.
that. And I think that's what I feel towards those films. Yeah.
Right. And you're talking about Puri, and all I could hear was of another filmmaker who recently made a very controversial film from Telugu in Hindi. And
Mm,
in general, I think Telugu is also the only industry where I find filmmakers who are immensely talented, who are like the top cream of the industry of sorts, who have
mm,
very right-wing views or
mm,
very fascistic tendencies. You see other industries, usually the perceptions that the talented artists are usually liberals or leftists at heart, right? But in
mm,
Telugu, it's rather the opposite. You will not confuse Puri Jagannath with being some sort of liberal person or any of the filmmakers. I mean, Vanga is a pretty recent and more flashy example, but a lot of them
mm,
have had not just right wing, but if you call Ayn Rand right wing, you could say even RGV from that generation onwards have not exactly fit that stereotype of an artist that people have.
mm.
That he's a leftist, he's sympathizing with these anti-social causes and all that,
Mm.
so-called anti-social causes. So, what do you think makes such a difference in Telugu?
I think it's interesting. I think the right wing tendencies come from different places in
Yeah,
Telugu. One, it comes from a certain conservative, traditionalist view that obviously, you know, there's a lot of pro-family, you know, sanskari kind of films that have come out. They've been coming out for a while.
yeah,
You talk, um, and so that obviously has a lot to do with the caste location and the class locations of the people who are making the films. Then you have the RGV thing. I was anti-tradition in a lot of ways, which is what makes films like Chanakshanam and all of these refreshing. But I also think, yeah, the Ayn Rand influence it's not traditionalist right wing. It's in a sense it is
libertarian.
the libertarian. Yeah, it's the individualistic libertarian.
Yeah,
I'll go my way, and this is also anti-tradition.
yeah,
But it's also very individualistic. It's very, so it's coming from a few directions. I think the idea of being a maverick and all of that is also what ties into that.
yeah,
Like and I think it also fellow travels with what's happening now, which is the left is perceived as the ones that are making all the impositions and saying don't say this, don't say that, whereas the right wing is has created this narrative where hey, you're permitted to say anything here, and and of course, the reality of what actually transpires is different, but I think that is also what is happening, especially with Sandeep Reddy, where all these people are coming to censor me and to censure me, and I should have the freedom to say what I want and whatever it
yeah,
is. And so I think that framing also ties into that idea of being a maverick and all of these things. And I think so, yeah, it's coming from a few places. I think the main thing with the Telugu film industry is also the fact that the media has never been strong,
hmm,
that the media has never been a counterweight to what the films have been doing. It's almost like a pure mass culture in the sense that the mass culture has not been tempered or has not been changed perceptibly by the media and voices from the media
hmm,
um, voices from the marginalized in a sense where yes, you had filmmakers trying to anticipate it. You had communist films. You had films that have addressed caste and all these things, but some of them opportunistically, some of them are good films.
Yeah.
But I think it's just that the media has not been strong, and the media has been in cahoots with um, the film industry and the powerful people and the elite in the film industry. And
Right.
I think that's a large part of it because if I mean the Tamil film industry, you look back at the strong culture of review writing that's
Yeah.
existed since forever. You'll find reviews of really negative reviews of really popular films.
Hmm.
Um, Ananda Vikatan and Kalki. Like it's gone back decades. With the Hindi film industry, I think it also has to do with the particular way that the Hindi film industry has come to form. Who was integral to forming it in Mumbai? There were so many women who were,
Yeah.
in powerful positions in pre-independent India in the film industry. Um, and I think yeah, it's the way that the film industries have been have has like come together, formed, constituted itself, and the fact that there have been no real they have been a few, but they've been the mainstream, the film industry, the big blockbusters. There's not really much the media is doing to, and right now there's a worrying trend of being anti-critic as well. Like
Yeah.
I remember some actor had just come out and said like had compared critics to like vermin or something, and
Yeah.
there's just this idea like, oh, the Prekshak Prekshaka Devullu or something,
Yeah.
and it's like, yeah, but the critics are just like voices from the audience,
Yeah.
and essentially, if you criticize critics, and I don't mean to imply that the critics can't be obnoxious sometimes, but if you're saying all critics are bad, that essentially means you're saying the audience doesn't have a voice,
Yeah.
and the audience is just
Yeah.
showing up and paying money. So,
I mean, I think it's just that. I mean, firstly, the critics in Telugu are not yet are not even critics. They're just giving bullet
mm,
points and giving ratings. It's not even proper film criticism, and these people have issues with that. But you said about the origin, and you can trace things from the origin, right? But if I think about the origin of Telugu cinema, we had a lot of leftists. I mean, Shri was a prominent lyricist. Arudra was a member of
mm,
the Communist Party. I believe Jaggaya was actually the first actor to become a Congress MP, and he was like a freedom fighter.
mm,
And there's a very famous story of N.T. Rama Rao once using his left hand to show the Abhay Mudra. And when he was
mm,
criticized for that, he apparently said that Rama and Krishna are leftists at heart.
mm,
And if you see a lot of his movies also, you see a lot more of like a Dravidian or a Periyarite philosophy and a lot of leftist, if Danavira Shivakarna and even Sita Rama Kalyanam to that matter.
mm,
So it seems like a bit of an abrupt turn from there to today, where we are like the most pro-ruling ideology industry that is there in India. I mean, it feels a lot more
mm,
like Hindi's affiliance is coerced, but Telugu is like a very enthusiastic and very willing participator in some of the trends.
mm. I think yeah, I think it's partly it's just I think a lot of filmmakers have felt that mythological films are something that Telugu filmmakers do well because
Yeah,
there's a tradition of mythological films.
yeah,
And now that there is a political sort of atmosphere that enables or that incentivizes that, I think a lot of people are just jumping in because most people in the film industries are opportunists, like
yeah,
because of the amount of money that's involved. Um, I think it's I mean when the incentives are aligned, I think it's easy to you know be a little flexible with your moral principles, justify them in or political principles and justify them howsoever. Um,
mm,
I've noticed, I mean the Telugu film industry, yeah, I think I think the media presence is, we come back to that because the how do you understand narratives of different political positions and why different political positions have emerged and how are these political positions still relevant? It's the media and it's the the education. How many humanities? How many schools can you go to in the Telugu states where you can actually come out with a good humanities education?
yeah,
You know, it's all those kind of things. How many where you get a good media education? It's and are these people who are getting these educations like going and working in the film industries? That's the other part of it. How? open is the film industry to newcomers or people who are coming from these backgrounds.
Yeah.
Um,
I
so
mean,
it's
we
a
didn't
combination
have
of all of those
proper
things.
movies made about a region that was 40% of Telugu population until that region
Mm.
fought for a state of its own and bifurcated itself. So
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think I think
Yeah, I
people
mean, you
can't
see,
complain about representation in that sense.
yeah, because you see
Yeah,
that. I mean, you see, this is a big discussion as well. Like I've had with somebody that the fact that you look at all those films set in Hyderabad over the 90s, over like the 2000s, and then you don't find people talking Telangana. Like the hero is going to be from Hyderabad, the heroine is going to be from Hyderabad. All of them are talking like Telugu, like
yeah,
the Vijayawada Guntur Telugu. And then there's like only comedy characters who are like talking Telangana, and the film is inviting you to make fun of them.
yeah.
So I mean, we've seen that. So yeah, I think that's it's what you said. It's just that the film industry isn't democratic necessarily, and either by who's constituting it. Yeah, um, they have been. I mean, Shrishi, yes, he was writing. He was writing songs for films. You had Arudra. You had many films had dialogues which were like opposing the emergency and things like that.
Yeah,
But I don't think ideologically there have been films that have also been coherent in a sense. Like we've
mm,
always made the big mass film
yeah,
and then had like overtures to certain political things that were happening at that time.
yeah,
But I don't think, I mean, Rangastalam is one film I can think of recently. There's obviously a lot of films like Virata Parvam, I'm sure. Um, there's films that Ante Sundaraniki possibly, but ideological coherence is another thing where people, for Telugu filmmakers, have always prevaricated. They said, "Oh,
yeah,
this is there, and then we should kind of marry the two, whatever." Like that's. I think Acharya is another is another example of
yeah,
the ideological incoherence to a certain degree. I think,
yeah.
yeah, it's just that the a lot of I just think that there is an understanding of politics that's missing a little bit. Um,
I mean,
there is
if
a great understanding of film grammar and
yeah,
that kind of stuff, but
yeah,
yeah, because if you look at a lot of Malayalam films, if you look at a lot of Tamil films, the films, in a sense, a lot of them are explications of ideologies.
yeah.
And that has not happened with Telugu.
Mm.
And so, yeah,
And even
historically,
the
that's just how it's been.
explicitly ideological films are made very badly. And even the communist, the Yara cinema movies, they're very
Mm,
unwatchable today. Like a lot of them,
mm,
Asay Ramalama, for example,
mm,
I was so shocked after watching the movie and realizing it's like a massive blockbuster because it is made in such a primitive way and it's made in such a pandering way. But I get that it probably articulated a sentiment that a lot of people
mm.
had and it spoke to a region that
Yeah,
was very underrepresented and that's why it did well. But
yeah.
cinematically, it's not a patch at all on like even the mainstream movies being made at the time. So I think maybe
Mm,
the ideology and good cinema have never really aligned in Telugu, maybe except like the 60s at
mm.
best. Yeah,
Yeah, that's fair. I think that it's that thing where the ideology also, when a film is ideological in Telugu, it wants you to know that it is ideological.
yeah,
You have people shouting from the rooftops about like things. Um, it's not that the film screenplay itself is woven around explicating a particular kind of ideology. It's so I think a lot of it is also. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people were coming from genuine places, but like it's I think the tendency to signal a certain kind of politics is higher than the embodiment of that politics.
hmm,
In a certain sense, I think. Yeah, and that's just because they want the sloganeering to become part of the mass appeal of the film rather than for that to be a part of the screenplay that then like it's something that you take apart and say, oh yeah, this is what the film is driving towards.
yeah,
um yeah, I think that's the tendency, and that's
yeah,
a very mass tendency, so
yeah.
it's like
So no surprises, Janacina was started by a cinema star, but I won't talk about that much because I don't want to be lynched or
mm,
something. But also in Telugu, right, there is also this tendency that one sees where you cinephiles often focus on a certain period and they sort of forget all the period that came before. Like today, I see a lot of
mm,
online discussions and all. People only talk about the 90s, the 2000s, and the
mm,
2010s. We don't talk about the 60s. And even if we do, we talk about those movies that are like the really big ones. Like we talk about
mm.
Maya Bazaar, we talk about, but it's been talked about enough already. We don't really see people who
Yeah.
are enthusiastically looking into the lesser known movies of that period, or maybe some
Mm,
underrated film or something like that. For example, I remember finding out about Aditya Subbarao thanks to Kamal Hassan's 70 movie list, and you will never hear about that director from any major person. No one talks
mm.
about him, but like this is like a huge guy. This is one of the most influential directors we've had and an
Yeah.
extraordinarily talented director and to boot. So what makes you
Yeah.
think that we have such poor film history, such poor cinephiles to be honest?
It comes back to the same thing. It comes back to the media and the humanities,
Yeah,
that and how much that has not been the way that it should be. Because Tamil films. When I started reading about cinema, I was reading Bharadwaj, right?
yeah,
And I understood that Mani Ratnam was influenced by Balachandar and Bharat Raja, and that there is a line that goes from the early filmmakers to the filmmakers now. And generally, I think this is what happens with film enthusiasts, is that we watch a film by a filmmaker and we are captivated by it. And then you
yeah,
watch a bunch of films by the same filmmaker, and then you trace back. You're like, who is this influenced by? Who is this influenced
yeah,
by? I got to Kubrick through Christopher Nolan,
yeah,
because of how much Nolan talks about Kubrick, and then like that's how you go back with either, that can be music, that can be movies, and anything, and that doesn't exist. There is an ahistoricity. I mean, this is said about India in general, but I think it's very specific to the Telugu film industry as well. That like nobody, a lot of the Telugu film fans on Twitter and everybody's like sharing films from like couple of years ago and saying this is the best movie ever made, and it's like yeah, there's and sometimes it's a remake of another film, you
yeah,
know. So there is a when that there's a lack of contextualizing these films. There's a
yeah,
lack of what is the to understand where these films are coming from. A lot of people today would not know who Dasan Naran is, and he
yeah,
was like the biggest, like he was the biggest guy in the industry, in
yeah.
the 90s and the 2000s.
Yeah,
Like,
well till now.
okay, thanks.
Yeah.